The doctor swore the boy was gone, his chest still, his pulse silent. Yet just as the grieving mother collapsed beside him, Daniel Frost opened his eyes and spoke, not with breath, not with life, but with a message no living child should have known. The winter of 1847 came earlier than anyone in Millcroft expected. By the first week of December, the sky had already turned a pale, unforgiving gray, and the wind rolled off the northern hills with a bitterness that seemed to grow sharper. Each day, snow blanketed the village in layers so thick it muffled sound, turning even the liveliest neighborhood into a world of hushed footsteps and frosted silhouettes. It was the kind of winter that made even the strongest of men whisper prayers before sleeping. To the Frost family, winter had always been a season of simple joys: hot broth simmering on the stove, hymns by the fire, and 7-year-old Daniel tracing his tiny fingers across the icy patterns on the window, pretending they were secret maps only he could read. But that winter was different. It arrived not with the usual playful dance of snowflakes, but with a strange heaviness, as if something unseen had climbed onto the village shoulders and decided to stay. And with it came a fever, one that moved swiftly from house to house, taking children first. It spared no street, no family, no heart. Mothers wrapped their young ones in layers of cloth and prayed. Fathers ran through the night in search of doctors, and the church bell, which normally rang only for weddings or Sunday service, tolled now for funerals. When the fever reached Daniel, it arrived quietly, no dramatic collapse or cry of pain, just a soft shiver one morning as he tried to get out of bed. "Mama, it's cold," he whispered, though the fire was still burning. Margaret Frost, his mother, pressed a hand to his forehead. A deep, sickening heat pulsed beneath his skin, stronger than any warmth the fireplace could offer. Her heart sank. She had seen this fever. She had buried neighbors' children because of it, but she would not bury her own. By midday, Daniel could no longer stand. By evening, he drifted in and out of restless sleep, and by the next morning, he began whispering things that brought chills to everyone in the room. "The tall man, the one with the lantern," he murmured, eyes half open though not fully awake. Margaret froze. "What man, Daniel?" But the boy didn't answer her. His gaze drifted to the ceiling, as if following something only he could see. "He's waiting by the bridge." "The silver one?" Daniel continued, his voice thin as thread yet oddly calm. Pastor Whitlock, who had come to pray with them, stepped closer with the caution of someone approaching the edge of a cliff. "It is the fever speaking," he whispered to Margaret. Children imagine things when their mind burns, but there was something about the way Daniel spoke, something soft, distant, almost aware, that made both adults fall silent. As hours passed, his fever worsened. The doctor, Ambrose Hilliard, was summoned and arrived with heavy boots covered in snow and eyes that looked far too tired for man. Still in his early 40s, he had been moving from house to house for 3 days, sleeping less than a few hours each night. His hands trembled as he unpacked his instruments. He had seen this illness too often. He had watched too many children slip away. He examined Daniel with slow, practiced movements, checked his pulse, his pupils, his breath. When he finished, he sighed quietly, a sigh so heavy Margaret felt her knees weaken. "Do whatever you can," she pleaded, grabbing his coat sleeve. "Doctor, please." "I will," he replied softly, "but prepare yourself. He is very weak." She collapsed into a chair, hands shaking violently. Daniel, blinking faintly, reached toward her with fingers barely able to lift from the blanket. "Mama, don't cry," he whispered. It broke her completely. For the next 3 days, Margaret refused to sleep. She sat by Daniel's side with a cloth in one hand and prayer in the other. She whispered stories from the Bible, hummed lullabies she hadn't sung since he was an infant, and begged God with a raw voice, "Please, don't take him from me." Sometimes Daniel responded. Sometimes he mumbled about rivers that glowed, fields without snow, and hands, warm hands, that held him whenever he felt scared. "Whose hands, sweetheart?" "The giant ones," he said. "They felt like home." Margaret thought it was the fever. It had to be. But on the 4th morning, long before the sun rose, Daniel's breathing grew shallow. Each inhale was a battle. Each exhale felt final. Margaret held his hand, her tears dripping onto the blanket. She whispered encouragements he couldn't Here, when his breath suddenly stopped, she felt it instantly. Daniel's chest went still. His body relaxed in a way no living child should. His eyes slowly closed. "Daniel, Daniel," she whispered, shaking him gently. "Honey." "Daniel." "Silence," she screamed, loud enough that the neighbors woke, loud enough that birds startled from trees, loud enough that her voice cracked and bled into sobs. Dr. Ambrose, who had been resting in the Frost sitting room, rushed into the bedroom. He pressed an ear to Daniel's chest, pressed fingers to the boy's wrist, tried again and again. No pulse, no breath, no warmth returning. He stood up slowly, painfully, as if every bone in his body resisted giving the words he had said too many times that winter. He placed a trembling hand on Margaret's shoulder. "Margaret." "He's gone?" Her world shattered with those 4 words. "No," she whispered at first, then screamed it, then kept screaming until her voice dissolved. Pastor Whitlock held her trembling shoulders as she sobbed over her son's motionless body. The room filled with neighbors who had rushed over when they heard the scream. Some cried quietly, some prayed, some simply stood in stunned silence, and then something impossible happened. Margaret, still leaning over Daniel's lifeless form, felt a slight twitch beneath her palm. At first she thought it was grief hallucinating, a desperate trick of her mind, but then Daniel's eyelids fluttered just once, then again, then they opened, fully. The color in his eyes wasn't the dull haze of fever. It wasn't the clouded emptiness of death. It was bright, clear, almost glowing with a soft, pearly light that reflected off the frosted window. "Mama," he whispered. Margaret gasped, stumbling backward. Pastor Whitlock's knees buckled. Dr. Ambrose froze mid-step, eyes widening in disbelief. Daniel's chest did not rise, his body did not breathe. But his lips moved and his voice, steady and soft, filled the room. "Mama, don't be afraid." Several women screamed. One man crossed himself repeatedly. The doctor whispered, "No, no, 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 that's not possible." But Daniel continued, his voice smooth and calm in a way it had never been before. "I wasn't alone," he said. He turned his head slightly, not toward his mother, not toward the doctor, but toward the far corner of the room, as if someone stood there. "Someone only he could see. He told me to come back," Daniel murmured, the man with the lantern. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth, shaking violently. "Sweetheart, you're alive, you." "But doctor." Ambrose cut her off, voice shaking. "He isn't breathing, he has no breath." It was true. Daniel's chest remained flat, unmoving, yet his words flowed like water. He said my time wasn't finished. Daniel whispered gently, "And that I must give you a message." A cold hush slipped across the room. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. "What message?" Margaret asked through tears, crawling toward him on trembling hands. Daniel's glowing eyes softened. "The person who thinks he is most alone," he said slowly, "is watched by the one who loves him most, even in the dark." His voice sounded like a memory, distant, echoing, slightly unreal. The room held its breath for him, waiting, trembling. Then Daniel's body jerked, his eyes rolled back, his mouth opened wide, and with a gasp, deep, shuddering, desperate, he finally breathed. Air rushed into his lungs as if he had been underwater for minutes. Color drained back into his cheeks. His chest rose and fell slowly at first, then faster, then normally. He collapsed into sobs of exhaustion, clinging to Margaret like a newborn clings to a heartbeat. People fled the room, some weeping from fear, others praying, others too stunned to speak. Pastor Whitlock dropped to his knees. "A miracle," he whispered. "Dear God, a miracle." Dr. Ambrose shook uncontrollably, the foundations of science cracking beneath what he had witnessed. Margaret held her son close, weeping into his hair, whispering thank yous with every breath she took. Daniel, half conscious, mumbled only one thing. He said, "I had to come back." There was something not finished. Later that evening, once neighbors left and the house returned to its fragile calm, Daniel sat up in bed. He looked around the room with a strange awareness, like someone who had returned from a long journey and found the world slightly changed. "Where did you go?" Margaret whispered, brushing his hair. Daniel looked at her for a long time, then pointed to the frosted window where snow fell silently. "Far," he said, but it wasn't scary. Margaret hugged him tightly, afraid to ask more. And Daniel, resting his cheek on her shoulder, whispered the last thing before falling asleep. He wasn't just a man with a lantern, Mama. He was waiting for me. Margaret did not sleep that night, not because of fear, but because every time Daniel's breath rose and fell, she thanked God for it. But in the village, whispers began to spread. Stories twisted in the cold air, carried from one doorstep to another. Daniel Frost died and spoke. A child came back. He spoke without breath. He saw someone on the other side. He returned with a message. Some called him blessed. Some called him cursed. Some feared him. Others wanted to touch his hands, hoping a miracle lingered on his skin. But Daniel cared for none of the whispers. The only thing that haunted him was the message he carried, and the lantern man's final words echoing softly in his mind. "Return, little one. Someone still needs you." The morning after Daniel Frost returned from the edge of death, the sun rose hesitantly, like even the sky was unsure how to shine upon a child who had crossed a boundary no living soul was meant to cross. The village of Millcroft awoke to whispers that carried faster than the winter wind. Every doorstep, every bakery line, every church pew buzzed with the same question: "Have you heard? The Frost boy died and came back speaking." Some spoke in fear, others in awe. The villagers who believed in miracles clutched their rosary beads with trembling fingers. Those inclined toward superstition muttered warnings under their breath, and a few, especially the old widows, wept openly at the thought that heaven might have brushed against their small village. Inside the Frost home, Margaret tried desperately to keep the world out. People knocked on the door every hour, neighbors, strangers from nearby towns, even a journalist from the distant city of Norfolk, all wanting to see the boy who had breathed without breath. Margaret turned every one of them away. Daniel was still weak, still pale, and the look in his eyes was different. Older somehow, quieter, as if he was holding something large and heavy in a heart still too small to carry it. Dr. Ambrose visited often, not out of duty but out of haunting bewilderment. Each time he checked Daniel's pulse, he did it with the caution of someone expecting the laws of nature to break all over again. It troubled him deeply that, of all the things he had studied, pulse rhythms, fevers, circulation, the one moment he couldn't explain had become the most real of his entire career. Pastor Whitlock prayed with the family every day, his words gentler than before. He never said it aloud, but deep inside, he feared that Daniel had seen something no child should see, not because it was evil, but because it was beyond the living. But Daniel himself didn't speak of the Lantern Man. Not yet. Not because he refused, but because each time he tried to remember, a strange ache filled his chest, a hollow pressure, like a locked door behind his ribs slowly pushing outward. One afternoon, a week after Daniel revived, Margaret sat beside him as he painted with the small set of watercolors his father had made before passing years ago. "What are you making?" she asked gently. Daniel didn't answer at first. His brush moved carefully, dipping into the blue, the silver, the white. Only when he finished the horizon did he speak. "It's the river," he said softly, "the one I saw." Margaret's hands tensed on her lap. "Darling, the river from your dream." Daniel shook his head slowly. "Not a dream, Mama." She swallowed hard. "Where was it, then?" Daniel paused. His brush hovered just above the page, dripping a single bead of blue onto the white paper. "I don't know the name," he whispered, "but I remember how it felt." "How did it feel?" He stared at the painting with eyes that were too old for 7. "Warm," he said, "safe, like someone was holding me without touching me." Margaret reached out and hugged him from behind, her chin resting on his small shoulder. "Let's not think about that anymore," she whispered shakily. "What matters is you're here." Daniel leaned into her warmth, but the weight in his chest didn't leave. He couldn't forget. He wasn't meant to forget. The message he carried still hadn't found its home. 2 weeks later, a blizzard swept into Millcroft with a fury that caught even the oldest farmers by surprise. Snow fell in thick, violent waves, clinging to windows and burying rooftops. The wind shrieked through every crack in every wall, rattling shutters, howling like a starving wolf searching for prey. Most families stayed inside, stacking extra wood near their stoves and checking their doors. Margaret did the same, though her worry wasn't for the storm. It was for the way Daniel had been acting since morning. He was restless, pacing from window to window, peering into the white curtain outside as if hunting for something. "Daniel, sweetheart, come sit by the fire," she said. "He didn't move, Mama," he said softly. "Someone's out there." Margaret's heart thumped painfully. "No, darling, the storm is too strong. No one would be outside in this." Daniel finally turned toward her. His eyes had that glow again, the same otherworldly shimmer they carried the night he returned from death. "I can feel it," he whispered. "Someone needs help." Margaret froze. She had promised herself she wouldn't fear her own child, but in that moment her hands trembled despite her best efforts. "Daniel, you're tired. You should rest." "No, Mama, please." His voice cracked with urgency. "He's cold, he's scared, he's alone." She stared at him, her breath trapped under her ribs. "Who, Daniel?" He shook his head helplessly. "I don't know, but I have to go." Margaret knelt in front of him. "You can't go out there. You'll get sick again." Daniel grabbed her hands, small, shaking, but filled with a determination that shouldn't have belonged to a child. "The lantern man said someone still needs me," he whispered. I think it's him." The room fell silent except for the storm raging outside. Margaret didn't believe in ghosts or visions. She didn't believe that messages could pass between worlds. But she believed in her son, and the look in his eyes, the same look he had before speaking without breath, was enough to crack every wall of doubt she had. She grabbed their heavy coats. "Show me where." The wind tore at them the moment they stepped outside. Snow pelted their faces like grains of sand. Every breath burned their lungs, but Daniel held his mother's hand tightly, guiding her with surprising certainty. "We're close," he kept whispering. "Almost, almost." The deeper they pushed into the forest, the darker everything became. The trees swayed wildly overhead, branches snapping under the storm's weight. Margaret's heart hammered with fear, not for herself, but for the fragile boy walking ahead of her with impossible resolve. Suddenly Daniel stopped. "There," he said, pointing through the swirling white. At first Margaret saw nothing, then her eyes adjusted, and she spotted the faintest flicker of orange light, trembling behind a broken window in a half-collapsed cottage. Her breath caught. Old Thomas Granger's home. Thomas had lived alone since his wife died 3 winters ago. Many said he barely spoke anymore. Others said he rarely left his bed. Margaret had planned to bring him bread last week, but exhaustion and grief had made her forget. Guilt stabbed her chest. They ran toward the cottage. The door creaked open with a painful groan, and a blast of icy air swept out. The single candle on the table flickered in the wind, its flame clinging desperately to life. The cottage was freezing, colder inside than out, and on the wooden floor, slumped against the leg of his bed, lay Thomas Granger. His gray beard was crusted with frost, his lips were blue, his hands, thin, shaking, almost skeletal, lay stiffly on the floor. Margaret gasped and shoved Daniel behind her. "Thomas," she cried, rushing forward. "Oh God." "Daniel, go back for Dr. Ambrose." "No." Daniel knelt beside the frail old man, touching his icy arm with gentle fingers. "He needs to hear it." Margaret stopped, not because she understood, but because something in Daniel's voice made her knees weaken. Daniel leaned close to Thomas's ear and spoke with the same soft, unearthly calm he had used the night he revived. "The lantern man said you're not alone," he whispered. "The person who thinks he is most alone is watched by the one who loves him most." Thomas's eyelids fluttered. Margaret gasped. He wasn't unconscious. He wasn't gone. He was listening, and Daniel kept going. "He said your pain was heard. He said your wife isn't gone from you, not the way you think." A ragged breath escaped the old man's chest, a breath Margaret was sure he didn't have the strength to take anymore. Tears leaked from Thomas's closed eyes. Margaret ran for help. The storm clawed at her as she sprinted back through the woods, but she didn't stop. She burst into the Frost home, screaming for the doctor. Dr. Ambrose ran faster than he ever had in his life. When they reached the cottage, Daniel was still by Thomas's side, holding his hand gently between his own small palms. "He heard me," Daniel whispered. He was waiting to hear it. The doctor worked quickly, checking vital signs, warming Thomas's body, forcing hot broth between his lips. And as the minutes passed, Thomas began to breathe more steadily. He survived, barely, but he survived. Thomas regained full consciousness 2 days later in the Frost's warm guest room. He woke to the crackling fireplace, to Margaret sitting beside him with a cup of broth, and to Daniel curled under a blanket on the floor, sleeping peacefully after refusing to leave Thomas's side for a moment. Thomas stared at the boy with trembling eyes. "Why?" he croaked, voice weak. "Why did you come to me?" Margaret hesitated. Daniel spoke instead. "I felt you," he said simply. Thomas's face crumpled. A quake of grief shook through him, grief Margaret instantly recognized but had no words to soothe. "I didn't want to live," he whispered brokenly. "I thought no one cared. I thought maybe if I let the cold take me, I could see my wife again." His voice broke entirely then. "I didn't think anyone would notice I was gone." Margaret covered her mouth, sobbing softly. Daniel climbed onto the bed beside him and placed one tiny hand on Thomas's chest. "But someone did," he whispered. "Someone was watching you, someone who loves you very much." Thomas stared at the boy, really stared with eyes wide and wet and disbelieving. "Who?" he whispered. Daniel smiled, not brightly, but with a quiet, tender warmth beyond his years. "The same person who told me to come back." Thomas's breath hitched. Margaret felt chills rise up her arms. Daniel leaned closer and touched Thomas's forehead gently. "You weren't alone," he whispered. "You were never alone." And Thomas finally wept, not from despair this time, but from release. As winter slowly melted into the pale softness of early spring, Thomas regained his strength. He stayed with the Frosts, refusing to return to the empty cottage that held too many memories of loneliness. He became a constant presence, a grandfather, like guardian to Daniel. Together they carved wooden toys, painted landscapes, and took long walks through the forest once the snow thawed. Thomas's laughter returned, slowly, then freely, then loudly enough that neighbors smiled when they heard it echo down the lane. To Daniel, he became the warm, steady hand he lost when his own father died. To Thomas, Daniel became the lantern in the darkness he had nearly surrendered to. One afternoon, watching Daniel and Thomas carve a wooden bird, Margaret stood in the doorway and felt tears warm her eyes. This right here, was the unfinished purpose Daniel had come back for, and she finally understood the Lantern Man's message. Life doesn't always return for the one who needs saving. Sometimes it returns for the one who needs reminding. Months later, when the air smelled of thawing earth and new blossoms, Daniel sat beside Margaret on the porch swing. "Mama," he asked softly. "Yes, sweetheart, I remember something else." She turned to him carefully. "About the man with the lantern," Daniel nodded. He wasn't holding it for himself. Margaret frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Daniel looked toward the horizon, watching the sunset stretch across the fields. "He was holding it for someone who was lost," he whispered, "to guide them back, to show them they were still seen." Margaret pulled him close, pressing a kiss to his hair. "And was that someone you?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "No," he murmured. "It was Thomas." A soft breeze rustled through the trees, and the message that had once belonged to another world had finally taken root in this one. For years afterward, people told the story of Daniel Frost, the boy who died, spoke without breath, and saved a life that winter. But the story didn't spread because it was supernatural. It spread because it carried a truth people needed desperately. No one is truly alone, not even in the darkest hour. Thomas lived many more years, never again letting grief convince him that he was forgotten. He passed away peacefully in his sleep when Daniel was a young man, with a quiet smile on his face. Some say in his final moments he saw a lantern burning softly in the distance. Daniel grew into a compassionate, gentle man who dedicated his life to people who felt unseen. Orphans, widows, the lonely, the forgotten. Whenever anyone asked him why, he always answered with the same simple words, "Because someone once returned to tell me a message." And he carried the Lantern Man's message with him for the rest of his days, lighting the way for others the same way it had once been lit for Thomas Granger.